My favorite superheroes are the ones that don't have to, as Stan Lee says, fool you into believing their powers. I like Iron Man because he uses physics and engineering to build his amazing suit, and I like how Thor flies because it's in accordance with the conservation of momentum. Now thinking about Ant-Man, I think he's right up there with them. In Marvel's Ant-Man, biophysicist Hank Pym gifts ex-con Scott Lang with a suit that can Honey, I Shrunk the Kids him down to the size of ants themselves without changing his mass. But how? Let's get the hand-waving explanations out of the way. Lang shrinks himself down by bombarding himself with so-called Pym particles. These particles are a fabrication, but their application actually makes a lot of sense. Let's start with the atom. In the first half of the 20th century, Danish physicist Niels Bohr came to dominate nuclear physics research, and his model of the atom, though no longer used, is still useful in some calculations and is instantly recognizable. Bohr proposed that electrons would only orbit an atom's nucleus at certain energy levels or quantized energy states. That means that the actual distance it orbits around the atom's nucleus, or the Bohr radius, is then dependent on the electron's energy. The Bohr model was one of the foundations of modern quantum mechanics, and we can use it to help explain Scott's shrinking. The potential energy of an orbiting electron is dependent on this Bohr radius and also its mass. That is to say, if you were to increase the mass of an electron, its Bohr radius, to keep the energy the same, must decrease. Now comes the superpower part. The reason why I cannot pass my hands through each other is because of the repulsion between the electrons on the surface of my hands. But if the Bohr radius decreases, then the atoms should have more room to come together. Their nuclei can get closer. If Pym particles could change the mass of Lang's electrons, every atom in his body could come closer together, and he could shrink down. At least that's the comic book style explanation, but we are conducting experiments right now that are similar, trying to coax electrons into becoming their heavier cousins, muons. If we were able to do something like that, we might get a superhero. Maybe. The mechanism for how Pym particles work, I think, is also the most reasonable explanation for how Pokeballs work, which we explored in my last Because Science video. But his suit would also need some special specifications to make shrinking survivable. Lang would need to breathe. Without oxygen tanks that got miniaturized as well, he'd suffocate. If you shrunk down to that size without oxygen tanks, you'd be effectively placing yourself in the oxygen-starved environment of a mountaintop. That's because if you shrink down in an area with a certain amount of air, the volume that air occupies drastically increases relative to you. Without some oxygen tanks providing you with air, then you wouldn't be able to get nearly enough of the mixture that you'd need at that size to stay conscious. The other problem is density. If you took Scott Lang's maybe 160 pounds and squeezed it into an ant-sized volume, that density would quickly match that of a white dwarf star, or 2 billion kilograms per cubic meter, which would mean that without any compensation, he would fall right through the Earth, or anybody he landed on, which would be pretty gross for a Marvel movie. But any possible breathing or density problems are eclipsed by the fact that Ant-Man in his amazing suit might be able to shrink down so small that he can time travel. Yeah, it's not that crazy, but that's a whole other video about the illusory nature of the laws of physics. Why? Because science. Want more science? Check out my last video on how Pokeballs might work. Subscribe to Nerdist for more videos if you want Because Science 2 days earlier than anyone else. Head to Vessel at vessel.com/Nerdist. And as always, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, hit me up in the comments section below. Thanks.